So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at and we're studying Simone de Beauvoir's Introduction to the Second Sex. We have already had one lecture on this text, and we move on with this text and this particular lecture. Now, if you remember where we stopped last time, Beauvoir talks about how the woman is defined as a lack, and how the woman is defined as a position apropos of the man, who is obviously the universal phenomenon. So in that sense, woman becomes the other to the man. So the man becomes the universal category, the man becomes the universal location, compared to which the woman becomes the peculiar location, the accidental location, the interrupted location, the incomplete location. Now, it's very important for us to understand how is this idea of other produced. So the production of other, or the othering, is something which is which happens in almost every narrative of exploitation, every narrative of domination, whether it's colonialism, whether it's racism, or whether it's patriarchy, etc. So that this model is something which we can use quite conveniently and map it onto other contexts as well. So this is Beauvoir moving on and talking about how the other is produced. The category of the other is as primordial as consciousness itself. In the most primitive societies, in the most ancient mythologies, one finds the expression of a duality, that of the self and the other. This duality was not originally attached to the division of the sexes. It was not dependent upon any empirical facts. It is revealed in such works as that of Granet on Chinese thought and those of Dumézil on the East Indies and Rome. The feminine element was at first no more involved in such pairs as Verona, Mithra, Uranus, Zeus, Sun, Moon, and Day-Night than it was in the contrast between good and evil, lucky and unlucky auspices, right and left, good and God and Lucifer. Otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. Now, this is a very important statement. Otherness as a fundamental category of human thought, because what that means essentially is that human thought always produces an idea of the other. So any form of identity formation is like a map making. So if you make any map, for instance, any act of map making is an act of inclusion, and equally is an act of exclusion, because the moment you draw a map somewhere, you're including certain space, and also equally you're excluding certain spaces. And likewise, human thought or production of identities always creates simultaneously the other identity. So the moment you create an identity of your own, you need to create an identity which is outside that identity parameter, right? So the otherness as a fundamental category of human thought is how human imagination functions, especially when it comes to identity formation. Thus it is that no group ever sets itself up as the one without at once setting up the other over against itself. So no group, whether it's a group of racism, group of men, group of any kind of ethnicity, no group formation happens without taking up the consideration of other as opposed to itself. If three travelers chance to occupy the same compartment, that is enough to make vaguely hostile others out of all the rest of the passengers on the train. In small town eyes, all persons not belonging to the village are strangers and suspect. So the whole idea of strangers becomes important over here. Who is a stranger? A stranger is someone you don't recognize. You don't recognize as one of your own, someone who comes from the outside. So in small town eyes, all persons not belonging to a village become other by default and become suspicious, where the whole process of becoming an other. Suspect the native of the country, who all inhabit the other countries as foreigners. Jews are different from the anti-Semite. Negroes are inferior for American races. Aborigines are natives for colonists. Proletarians are the lower class with the privilege. So the whole idea of lower class, savages, foreigners, different, inferior, they all are spoken from a position of privilege, from a subject position, right? So who are they inferior compared to? Who are the lower class compared to? So it becomes a relative condition. So what is assumed over here is that there is a fundamental category which is universal. There's a fundamental category which is vertical, so to say, as opposed to which, and this imagination of verticality, this imagination of universality, is one of the first conditions of identity formation, that you create a hypothesis whereby certain identity becomes the benchmark, it becomes a 0 point, the touchstone for every other kind of identity. And how to define the touchstone? How to determine what is a touchstone? That brings into positions of power, that brings in discourses of power, privilege, hierarchy, etc. Right? Okay. So Lévi-Strauss, at the end of a profound work on the various forms of primitive societies, reaches the following conclusion. passage from the state of nature to the state of culture is marked by man's ability to view biological relations as a series of contrasts, duality, alternation, opposition, and symmetry, whether under definite or vague forms, constitute not so much phenomena to be explained as fundamental and immediately given data of social reality. So this is a very important statement that Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, makes, and which de Beauvoir is drawing on. And Lévi-Strauss says apparently that the passage from nature to culture, when you move from the natural to the cultural in any kind of society, any kind of demography, through primitive societies, any primitive society, it makes an effort, or historically it is moved towards being cultural from the natural. And that journey from natural to cultural has always happened, has always taken place through the production of dualities, to the production of otherness, evil versus good, dark versus light, desirable versus undesirable. That's how culture is formed, because any formation of culture is dependent on the production of other. So that transition from the natural to cultural is dependent on the necessity or the possibility of producing the other, right? And that's something that Lévi-Strauss talks about quite clearly. Okay, so so a series of contrasts, duality, alternation, opposition, and symmetry, whether under definite or vague forms, constitute not so much phenomena to be explained as fundamental and immediately given data of social reality. So it's not really necessary to explain logically the duality, the symmetry, the differences in power, etc. But what is more important is these things are taken for granted and internalized and consumed as social reality or data of social reality. And of course, this is imagined data. This is fantastic data, as it were, or pseudo data. But this data become very, very important and almost vital data for the production of culture, for the production of cultural identity. So this movement from nature to culture depends on the production of opposites, the production of others, the production of dualities, the production of opposites, the production of all kinds of conflicts, because that defines the way identities are formed in a certain cultural context, right? So culture is dependent on the production of other in a very, very vital and organic way. And that's something that Lévi-Strauss speaks from an anthropological perspective, and obviously de Beauvoir is drawing on Lévi-Strauss and saying that how this kind of formation from nature to culture is operative even with the patriarchy, because what we find is the move towards culture is a move towards masculinity or maleness. So men have culture, men have cultural space, men inhabit public spaces of culture, whereas women are relegated to being bodies only, to being nature only. And that contrast is a very convenient contrast for patriarchy to operate and continue to discriminate and continue to hierarchize itself as opposed to women. So these phenomena would be incomprehensible if, in fact, human society were simply a medicine or fellowship based on solidarity and friendliness. So if human society were simply an act of solidarity, and a medicine is a human condition where solidarity or comradeship or collaboration takes place. And if that were the case, if human society were simply a solidarity, then this would be an impossibility. There'd be no necessity, in other words, to create contrasts, to create opposites. But the fact that we need to create opposites is because we don't really belong, we don't really have a medicine or fellowship based on comradeship and solidarity and friendliness. Every culture, instead, is basically a condition produced out of opposites, produced out of differences, produced out of hierarchies, etc. Things become clear, on the contrary, if following Hegel, we find in consciousness itself a fundamental hostility towards every other consciousness. The subject can be opposed only in being opposed. He sets himself up as the essential, as opposed to the other, the inessential, the object, right? So the subject poses itself only in being opposed. So position and opposition go hand in hand. And this is a really beautiful sentence, and it really sums it up so well and so coherently, where Beauvoir is quite clearly saying that every act of subject position requires a subject opposition. So position and opposition go hand in hand. So if you want to occupy the position of a subject, you need to create an opposition, apropos of which your position is produced, right? So she draws on Hegel and says that if you follow Hegel, you find in consciousness itself a fundamental hostility towards every other consciousness. So the whole idea of mid-sen as being a human condition, characterized by solidarity and fellowship, is a utopian condition, an ideal condition which doesn't exist. Now, what does exist instead is the idea of culture, is the idea of position or subject position, which requires opposition in order for its own positionality to be produced, right? So, in order to be essential, you have to produce the inessential. In order to have a position, you have to produce the opposition. So that necessity to produce opposites, the necessity to produce the other, is unfortunately the true human condition, as opposed to the idea of medicine or fellowship based on solidarity and friendliness. So this idea becomes very, very helpful and very, very crucial in the Beauvoir study of femininity and masculinity over here. But the other consciousness, the other ego, sets up a reciprocal claim. The native traveling abroad is shocked to find himself in turn regarded as a stranger by the natives of neighboring countries. As a matter of fact, wars, festivals, trading, treatises, and other contests among tribes, nations, and classes tend to deprive the concept of other of its absolute sense, and to make manifest its relativity. Willy-nilly, individuals and groups are forced to realize the reciprocity of the relations. How is it then that this reciprocity has not been recognized between the sexes? The one of the contrast in terms is set up as a sole essential, denying any relativity in regard to this correlative and defining the latter as pure otherness. Now, this is where de Beauvoir begins to get more and more, she sort of begins to calibrate the subcategories within this otherness. So she says quite clearly that, you know, if you travel through festivals, if you travel through nations, if you travel through any kind of, you know, collaborative categories, you find that the whole idea of otherness becomes quite diluted, because you realize that you are in a position apropos of some other position. So, you know, that reciprocity is recognized to a certain extent when it comes to race, when it comes to ethnicities, when it comes to language, when it comes to culture, etc. Now, the question then obviously arises is, then how come this reciprocity, or at least this recognition of reciprocity, hasn't you know, come into being, or hasn't appeared when it comes to the sexes, when it comes to the, you know, male versus female thing, right? So how is it that we still continue to talk about the woman as being the inessential, as being the you know, the incomplete counterpart of man, etc. Okay, so why is it that women do not dispute male sovereignty? No subject will readily volunteer to become the object, the inessential. So, you know, any act of any human being with dignity, or any human subject with dignity, will not want, not desire to be the object, which is inessential, which is required for someone else to be essential, right? So no one will accept it, you know, without any kind of contest or any kind of resistance. So what is the peculiar case of this sexual difference, or this gender difference, which makes it more permanent in quality to a certain extent? It's not the other who, is, in defining himself as the other, establishes the one. The other is posed as such by the one and defining himself as the one. But if the other is not to regain the status of being the one, he must be submissive enough to accept this alien point of view. Whence comes the submission in the case of women? So that's the key question that Beauvoir is asking over here. So what is this whole idea of submission when it comes to women? So why is it there's no contest historically in terms of not accepting itself as the other, or rather say that we are the one as opposed to which man is the other? So what is the submission? What is the ontological quality of the submission? What is the experiential quality of submission in the case of woman, as Beauvoir asks quite clearly? There are, to be sure, other cases in which a certain category has been able to dominate another completely for a time. Very often this privilege depends upon inequality of numbers. So sometimes it's just purely mathematical. It's a question of numbers. Sometimes some people are more in relation to others, so they have more territorial advantage. They have more numerical advantage, which then spills over, which then extends onto a discursive advantage or into political advantage, etc. So a larger army can vanquish a smaller army on a purely numerical basis, and more often than not. So very often this privilege depends upon inequality of numbers. The majority imposes its rule upon the minority or persecutes it. But women are not a minority. So if you take the numerical logic that, you know, is the more number harassing or exploiting the lesser number, that wouldn't work in the case of women, because it's more or less equal in terms of number. Women are not a minority, like the American Negroes or the Jews. So, you know, there's a difference to be made between the woman and the American Negroes or the Jews, because the Jews are a minority in terms of numbers. The women are not a minority in terms of numbers. So what is it that makes them the other of men? Sometimes unquestionably. There are as many women as men on earth. Again, the two groups concerned have often been originally independent. They may have been formerly unaware of each other's existence, or perhaps they recognize each other's autonomy. But a historical event has resulted in the subjugation of the weaker by the stronger. The scattering of the Jews, the introduction of slavery into America, the conquest of imperialism are examples in point. In these cases, the oppressed retain at least a memory of former days. They possess a common past, a tradition, sometimes a religion or a culture. So in the case of, for instance, colonialism, there was a time where the colonizer and the colonizer did not know each other. They were completely autonomous from each other, different from each other. So before colonialism happened, the colonized natives had their own traditions, had their own religion, had their own culture, which were then obviously wiped out with the arrival of colonialism. But then it is possible to produce a past, or at least remember a past, before colonialism, where there was some sense of identity which suffered erasure, which is the term used in post-colonial studies. So the parallel drawn by Babel between woman and the proletariat is valid, in that neither ever formed a minority or a separate collective unit of mankind. And instead of a single historical event, it is in both cases a historical development that explains the status as a class and accounts for the membership of a particular individual in that class. But proletarians have not always existed, whereas they have always been women. So even in the case of proletariat and the upper class, we find that that too came out of something, right? It did not exist from the word go. It did not exist from the inception. Some people got richer, some people did not get so rich, and that's how the class divisions took place. And then we had the bourgeois and the proletariat as different categories. But there was a time where there was no proletariats, right? So, so the proletarians have not always existed, whereas have always been women. They are women in virtue of their anatomy and physiology. So, since the beginning of human species and the beginning of human civilization, women have always been women in terms of the virtue of the anatomy and physiology. Throughout history, they have always been subordinated to men, and hence the dependency is not the result of a historical event or social change. It was not something that occurred, so it was not an occurrence. So the subjugation of women is not an occurrence like colonialism. So the colonial army comes in, wipes out the natives and sets up their own civilization. That's an occurrence in human history. Slavery is an occurrence in human history. Anti-Semitism is an occurrence in human history. So it happened at a certain point of time in human history, prior to which there were different situations, prior to which there were different demographic conditions. But when it comes to women, there's always been women from the very inception of human civilization. So that occurrence is not really an occurrence. Or female subjugation is not really an occurrence. There's a key difference between female subjugation and imperialism, or female subjugation and class struggle, as de Beauvoir is very clearly mapping out. The reason why otherness in this case seems to be an absolute is in part that it lacks the contingent or incidental nature of historical facts. A condition brought about at a certain time can be abolished at a certain other time, as the Negroes of Haiti and others have proved, but it might seem that a natural condition is beyond the possibility of change. So something which happened in human history can also unhappen. An occurrence which came can also be retaliated against. So when the white man comes, takes away the independence of people from some other part of the world, their independence can be regained, their independence can be fought back. Because it did happen at one point in time, that can be undone. But something which has always been there is quite possibly beyond the possibility of change, as de Beauvoir is suggesting. In truth, however, the nature of things is no more immutably given once for all than a historical reality. If woman seems to be inessential, which never becomes essential, it is because she herself fails to bring about this change. So it's a woman who fails to bring about this change, according to Beauvoir. Proletarians say we, Negroes also, regarded themselves as subjects that transform the bourgeois, the whites, into others. So you can turn it the other way around. Where proletarians would say the we are the we and the bourgeois are the others. Negroes will say, or the black men will say, the we are the we and the white men are the others. So they can turn the table on the whole politics of otherness. But women do not say we, except at some congress or feminist or similar formal demonstration. Men say woman, and women use the same word in reference to themselves. They do not authentically assume a subjective attitude. The proletarians have accomplished the revolutions in Russia, the Negroes in Haiti, the Indo-Chinese are battling it for Indochina, but the woman's effort has never been anything more than a symbolic agitation. They have gained not only what men have been willing to grant, they have taken nothing, they have only received. So, this becomes a critique of women that is done by de Beauvoir way. So she says that the proletarians have accomplished the revolution in Russia, where the Tsar was abolished, Tsarism was abolished, and the Bolshevik party came to power, which then became the Communist Party. The Negroes in Haiti have done a similar thing. They've done away with white imperialism and they gained back the territory. The Indo-Chinese, which is obviously the Vietnam War, which has been referred away, are battling for it in Indochina against imperialists, the American invasion, for instance. But a woman's effort has never been anything more than a symbolic agitation. So what de Beauvoir seems to suggest, or seems to want to weigh, as a real agitation rather than a symbolic agitation. So the reality becomes more important for de Beauvoir, and she wants women to possess the reality rather than just a symbolic presence. They have gained only what men have been willing to grant them. So only that men have given them and granted them and conferred on them from the position of privilege. They've just taken that. They have taken nothing. They've only received. So they need to possess power. They need to take power. They need to appropriate power, what belongs to them. They haven't done that. Just received privileges that men have given to them. So that's a very key condition, a very key difference that de Beauvoir is mapping out between the woman condition and the class condition and the race condition, which do have problems of subjugation, harassment, exploitation, hierarchy, etc. But there's a fundamental difference between those conditions and this condition. So one is a temporal difference, that those conditions of colonialism or racism or domination of race or language happened at a certain moment of historical time. So it was an occurrence, and once it was done, it can be undone, so it can be retaliated against, whereas the woman condition has been happening since the beginning of human civilization. The women have been subjugated. And secondly, the retaliation is real when it comes to political struggles, or race struggles, or ethnicity struggle, etc. Whereas the retaliation for the woman, according to Beauvoir, is strictly speaking symbolic in quality, and that needs to change according to Beauvoir's argument. So we stop at this point today, and we conclude with this text and the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.